Thank you for joining us on the fourth day of ETS 2023 and our 10-year anniversary. Apparently today is the weirdest day yet, which is kind of hard to imagine, but very excited about that. We're going to be talking about infrastructure modernization on this next panel, and we have some really interesting perspectives. I think we're going to get into some cool details and all kinds of things. So if you would please give a round of applause for our speakers. We've got Kimberly Britton, the CEO of EPIcenter, Dan Forman, CEO of Copper Labs, Nate Gillespie, Director of Customer Solutions for PEPCO, holding Angie Ostaszrwski, Energy Efficiency Consultant for Ameren. Round of applause, please. All right, good morning. So I've been asking everyone on my panels this question because I love to hear the answer and to get to know them as people before we get to know them as professionals. So Kimberly, would you start us off? What energizes the work that you do?
Well, I think for EPIcenter, it's really, we're an energy innovation center, and we work with a lot of utilities and matching their innovation aspiration to their reality and aligning those with their strategy. It is not on. I used to run sound, and I didn't look. I trusted. Trust but verify, right? So you may have heard that because I speak loudly, according to my mother. But nonetheless, for EPIcenter, it really is for the utilities that we work with, it's aligning their innovation aspirations to their everyday reality. And that really is energizing to us. It's exciting to see it happen. So,
great, thank you. Dan?
Good morning. For me, I think we're all here because we recognize that we're in the middle of a climate crisis and we need to do things. And, I've been working in tech startups and early stage venture-backed companies for more than 20 years. And there are a lot of ways to spend your time, and I think few are more substantive than this. And so, utilities need a lot more solutions than what they've had available to date. And so I'm glad to be part of a lot of good early stage companies stepping in to help.
Thank you so much. Angie?
Hi, I'm Angie Ostaszrwski. I work for Ameren, Illinois. I said this earlier this week in a session, but we're basically the utility that's not covering Chicago and Illinois, so the rest of it. I am newer to the utility space. I've been at Ameren since 2016, and before that I was in community and economic development work, and it can feel really futile when you're trying to work on housing, workforce development, safety, and all these things all at the same time, and it feels like you're almost like digging at the beach, but it's always very shallow and the sand keeps falling back in. But what I love about being in energy is one where we have to figure out how to serve everyone, so you can't make the argument that certain customers don't apply, and we can deeply impact one area that's really key in someone's life. And I found that what we do at my company is much more impactful than the work I was doing before, where we were trying to be holistic, but it was kind of like we weren't making a lot of progress anywhere.
Thank you. Nate?
I'll say, so I'm Nate Gillespie. I work for PEPCO Holdings. One of our companies, not in PEPCO but Exelon, has the rest of Illinois.
We can share.
I would say there's two things that, through my career working in the utilities, first of all, I'm a marketing professional. First time I worked for a utility was PEPCO in Philadelphia, and I remember thinking that, wow, the biggest emergency I ever dealt with was the website wasn't working for a few minutes. And now I'm in an environment where I'm sitting in an emergency operations center, 911 center, in the middle of the night because there's a hurricane coming through. And it struck me that what I was now doing touched every single person. Every single person that lived in my area was my customer. That's a different perspective from a normal marketing person. So that was one thing that actually gave me a lot of energy and really excited me about the work. Now I've switched more toward, we're on the edge of the utility industry completely changing. The work that I'm specifically doing in PEPCO with solar interconnections, in particular energy efficiency, to start working toward electrification is really exciting, and it's not easy. It's difficult. It's a difficult challenge. The challenge that I have is that we're working in multiple jurisdictions. So you have different areas that have different goals, different regulatory structures. It's kind of exciting and really energizing to weave that needle and get everybody what they want.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So as you can see, we definitely have different perspectives and backgrounds here, so it's going to make for a very interesting conversation about infrastructure, right? So how does infrastructure modernization impact communities in the long term? Angie, I'd love for you to kick it off with your background and set the stage for the next phase of the conversation.
Yeah, the conversation about infrastructure modernization and including our communities, I feel like the biggest challenge or the biggest piece I'm thinking about is utilities like to be in control. We like to control the process from start to finish. And if we're really going to look at infrastructure with our customers, we have to figure out how to talk about it in the scope of the world they live in. So if you're having an open house about some kind of grid modernization in your area, personally, I as a customer wouldn't have gone before I worked for Ameren. In the neighborhoods I live in, what our residents care about is we're in communities that don't have cars, but we don't have sidewalks. We don't have good street lighting. Our bus stops don't have shelters. The roads are crumbling. And so having to consider this sort of energy upgrade totally separately from the rest of your life is not how people think, but utilities have to give up a lot of control in the conversation and be willing to slow down, partner up, time our projects, bring in folks who are working on these other pieces, and be willing to speak up on behalf of our customers to push for those other upgrades as part of, a holistic community that we're trying to build together. And I still think culturally at these companies, we're years away from effectively doing that, but I think it's certainly much better than when I started a few years ago.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, to Angie's point, there are a lot of different people out there that can help utilities meet the moment on the energy transition, and yet today it's been about fancy in-home smart home equipment. It's been about EV tariffs, and there's a lot of other folks that will engage. And so, we've worked with a bunch of utilities on behavioral programs, and you'd be pretty surprised the number of people that will lean in and help, whether it's to avoid an outage. But the one predictable thing about human behavior is we tend to respond to incentives. If the money gets high enough, they'll do things. And so there are all sorts of non-wires alternatives, non-pipes alternatives, if you can engage people in a way that works for them. And a lot of folks don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have the money for smart home. They can still make a lot of decisions to help utilities flatten those curves, create load flexibility, and avoid outages. We see, whether it's the emergency text system in California last summer, a lot of the things that go on here in Texas, people are willing to engage if you can find the right incentive structure. And there are a lot of creative ways we've seen utilities do that, but there's a whole lot of them available that haven't even been tapped.
Fantastic. Thank you. Nate?
I think one of the things that you're seeing as we're starting to pivot, one thing I was thinking about is we've instituted chief customer officers to make sure that the voice of the customer is moving through the organization, and they're tasked with making sure that you're putting the customer first. I would say the old way was of a position of no. I would hear that from my team a lot of, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that because, and that comes from the history of our responsibility is keeping those lights on all the time. So when you're in a place where something new is threatening your ability to keep the lights on for everybody, and I don't think people understand that. It's not necessarily that there's a concern about decentralizing the energy. It's, well, what happens if you don't have that control and this supermarket with this solar array trips off this transformer and 50,000 people are out. So it's not that supermarket that's in the news. It's not the supermarket that's hauled in front of regulatory bodies. It's the utility. So making sure that there's technology in place to be able to allow for some of that stuff to happen.
Thank you. Kimberly?
So all of this is, absolutely meaningful. I'm going to, for us, I will shift the conversation a little bit to say that we went from grid modernization, meaning the vetting and potentially operationalizing of emerging tech to serve their ability to serve their customers, to be more reliable, and to drive toward affordability. In the last 2 years, year and a half, we have watched the why of that conversation shift to resilience. And so that now the focus is, yes, some things may be cool and interesting, but if they don't make us more resilient in the face of these storms, these outages that we're facing, and this I'm not only seeing in Texas, I see with our client in Washington State. I mean, we're beginning to see this being the mantra, that if it doesn't serve that, then that grid modernization may be helpful, it may be important, but it's not satisfying that core why of why we need to move and move faster. Then, I mean, their time is running out for this because they are being hauled up. I think those of us in Texas are acutely familiar with that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we all know that cost is a huge barrier to this, and it's a necessity that it has to happen somehow, some way. So we're not really going to talk about that today because it's one of those things that I don't think any of us have fully figured out yet, but we'd love to. So if you have a brilliant idea, let us know. But what are the biggest challenges besides cost to modernizing the existing infrastructure, Nate?
I'd say one of the it's related to cost, but it's really in the regulatory space, getting the freedom to be able to have flexibility. I think flexibility is key when you're in an environment that is very prescribed. It's legal. These are legal proceedings that are very specific. So being able to write in and have that trust that you should have that flexibility to do what's right for the customer, do what's right for the grid, that's one of the, I think, the keys to moving forward, and that's stuff that we're working on. Stakeholder engagement. You have to build the trust. So if you do not have the trust in the community, it's going to be very difficult for you to say, hey, great idea, we're going to modernize the grid, we're going to go do this. Well, you didn't deliver on this, and this. Why would we trust you to deliver on that? So this is something that is going to take some time if you're in a bad space with your customer base and your stakeholders. But socializing what your intentions are, making it very transparent, and engaging them in the conversation. Because one of the worst things that can happen is that you're about to cite a large project, and the community says, no, we don't want it there, and puts a halt because you didn't engage them in the beginning.
Great, thank you. Angie?
I'm going to half answer your question and half just jump on my little soapbox about data
Please do.
and digital infrastructure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to my soapbox. So in my role at Ameren, I manage our market development initiative. And essentially, since 2018, I've managed contracts with about 40 nonprofits. Back in 2018, it was like really in startup mode. So I came from a program management and marketing background, and a lot of what I ended up doing was contracting, invoices, memorandums of agreement. I never drafted so many contracts, and I was the one area in my group where all of the contracts were direct with the utility. And I think sometimes we talk about, these tangible things we can see and feel, and in order to even get to that, we have to get a contract. And in order to contract with a nonprofit or small organization, for them to have a compensated role in the conversations or the programming you're doing, you first have to educate your system within the utility on how do we adjust. We're not going to give a $5 million cyber insurance requirement to a nonprofit that doesn't have an IT department. Like, we're just not going to do that. So how do we move forward with, I think a lot of times when we talk about data at the utility, it's how can we make it as secure as possible, as safe as possible. But then how do you balance that if we really want to be integrated partners in our community in terms of working together? And so what we have done is we've had to change our procurement process. We've created custom contracts and really had conversations about if you're working with a community action agency to do outreach on a grid modernization project, at what point does their client data become utility data? Because utilities think any data that touches us is our data. But these are agencies that already have this information in-house. And if you can't figure out how to partner with them without burdening them with all of these requirements and intimidating pieces, that's also part of being a good partner in the community. And you have to take away, we're very process oriented, right? We always want to scale things and make it more efficient. But in cases like this, you really have to look at it from top to bottom on a case-by-case basis, and that can be a challenge it's kind of a change management project. But that's a really big part of my job that I never thought would be a big part of my job, and if anyone wants to nerd out about how to write a contract, let me know. No one's going to talk to me after the session.
Thank you so much. Kimberly.
I think in addition to the financial challenge, which is huge, right, is the other thing are time. With, they're keeping the lights on, doing the day job is already a challenge. The aging infrastructure is already at, we talk about technical debt. You're at an infrastructure just from the age of, you're an age debt, I guess, for lack of a better term. You're not starting from here, you're starting from here in some cases to bring some very old infrastructure to where you need to be, whether that's your technical infrastructure, your physical infrastructure. And then your human capital piece, right, of who's on deck to handle the work that's ahead. We recently did an overhaul. A utility had spec'd its hiring for the rest of 23, for 24 and 25. And so one of the things that we spent 4 days with them was realigning, because one thing they asked the question, do we even have the right positions specified to do the work that we need to do for whether it's handling this infrastructure piece or the softer skills, if you will, of our future. And so we spent 4 days with them overhauling how they thought about workforce. That's a non-traditional thing for us to do, but it's a critical thing to really make sure that you're deploying the human capital to match all of the other technical pieces or the structural pieces.
Great, thank you. Oh. Sorry, that distracted me for a second. Dan.
Yeah, for me, it's time, and we're out of time. It's easy to say let's electrify everything, but I think we all recognize that there's a big bunch of things that would have to happen that are impossible to do that. And so, what's the answer? And the answer is that you find your way to the middle. You have a reasonable conversation around what can you do with what you already have, and I think that one of the limiting factors for utilities has been a handful of very large vendors that have all marched in the same direction, and the world's changed. We can't say, hey, when I get to a shiny future where I have AMI in 5 years, for example, all my problems are going to be solved. I think we've all seen that it hasn't really solved problems to date, and so maybe we should think about where could that money be better spent, and we think that money can be better spent on digital solutions that create load flexibility, engage people. And I'm self-interested here. I can unlock real-time data from pretty much any meter out there. And so if you can make the demo legacy meters smarter than the newest smart grid, why not go spend $500 million on things that actually move the needle? Build places where you can actually get density on EV charging. And so there are a whole lot of new things that are available. I think that, for companies like ours, and we're a venture-backed startup. We've got investment from some of the biggest funds out there, National Grid, and yet I need a megaphone to get attention. And to Angie's point, we spend a lot of time in utility procurement and just absurd requirements like, hey, we need you to get $100 million worth of surety bonds to do something that doesn't rise to that level of need. And so whether it's rethinking what we've always thought this is the single line we need to walk to get to grid mod, or this is the way that our contracting works, you are blocking out a whole lot of opportunities if you put up these barriers that Angie's trying to knock down, for example.
Great.
Who did that to you? Let me talk to them.
Angie's going to handle it. Thank you so much. So modernization is kind of a big, broad, fancy term for all kinds of things, and there's lots of different ways to approach it. And it's not to say that anyone isn't doing it well, but it is a big, hairy thing to contend with. So, Kimberly, how do utilities best approach modernization?
Well, you're going to hear that saying I love to say about I stole this from my friend she's a retired Air Force pilot. And she says, in the Air Force, we say there's a lot of thrust, but no vector. And there's a hand signal, a lot of thrust, but no vector. And I think that there is, and I think it would be insulting to say that utilities don't have vector. But I would say that there is a lot of activity and thrust and resources being spent that don't always support the stated strategic objectives of the organization, particularly around the things they consider to be innovative. So part of the goal is to encourage, to support the utility sector as they align that thrust because you can't do everything. It's huge, right? The burden of what you have to face to do your daily job and then also be innovative, and the pressure to comply, and the lack of sometimes understanding of your regulators, all of that's a challenge. So what do? You pick the things that move the needle the most, and this has been said. You pick the things that align with your strategic objectives, that will move the needle the most, that in a year or two you can point to that and say, that made the difference for us as we advanced our modernization, the improvements to our infrastructure, and serves our customers better. And if you had 3 of those wins in a fairly compact period of time, you will be able to move on to something else. Now, that's a perfect world, right? But that's really what I'm finding is that there's so much noise. And where we best serve our friends and our clients in this area is to help dial through that noise and bring focus to this incredible work that you all are doing.
Thank you so much. Dan?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, to Kimberly's point, I come from an agile software development background where, instead of spending 18 months and thinking, I can predict the future, I'm going to lock everything in, we'll march for 18 months, and when we get done, we're going to have a perfect product. The world changes faster than that, and if you can break things down incrementally, I think it also motivates the internal innovation teams at utilities. You need wins to stay motivated, and if you have a 5-year project, you're going to get dragged into the mud. Invariably, things change, and so finding ways to break things down iteratively, incrementally, and whether that's with internal innovation teams, rolling things out to your customers and learning from them. One of the things that we regularly talk about is turning ratepayers into collaborators, and when utilities do that, it tends to work, and I think it's been proven out, and it's just not been propagated broadly enough around the industry, and so I'm happy to hear you helping to do so.
Awesome. Nate?
I think your comment about a lot of thrust and no vector, I found myself in that situation where all of a sudden a lot of attention came to my area as I was stepping into the role. With community solar, you go from, you've got a lot of initiatives, and once they start rolling, it starts making quick impact. So when you've made adjustments for 10 customers, and then now you have 20 customers, okay, we can deal with that. Well, all of a sudden, when there's 1,000 different units, that's IT systems, and you can't necessarily, you can predict where you need to go if you have that vector where you know where you're headed. But if you're trying to keep the wheels on the car as you're running, it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes to see where you're going. So after we had some struggles in that space, a lot of attention was there. A lot of resources started becoming available, and it's like, okay, what do we pick? So going through and trying to figure out how do you get those quick wins, because I thought you need to make some improvements. You need to show that we want the process to be better. We want to encourage this. And one area, very simple, it doesn't have to be super innovative, but one of the biggest things that we realized was a problem was in an interconnection process for a DER to connect to the grid, there's 17 different departments that are involved. There's, on my own team of people processing that application and walking it through, there would be maybe 4 people that would touch it. So I could never find out who was responsible. So someone complains and says, hey, we need this PTO right now. It would take 4 hours for someone to tell me who to ask. And so simple, innovative thing was, okay, one person's responsible. You own this application from start to finish. And that made a vast improvement in communication and trust, to build the trust with the people that are working with us to be able to show that we can start making improvements here.
Awesome, thank you. And did you?
No.
Okay, Angie.
Can you say the question one more time? I just got lost in everyone's answers and I forgot what even was the
Yeah,
the initial-
absolutely. Essentially, I was asking, like, how do you think utilities can best approach modernization from your perspective?
Okay, thank you for refreshing my memory. So the other part of my job at Ameren and Energy Efficiency is pilot design, piloting new programs. And so I probably shouldn't say this as an innovation professional, but something I've seen, and again, my short time in the utility, is sometimes we want to go for something shiny and new, and we completely forget about the basics. It's like icing a cake that hasn't finished baking. I don't know if that's a good metaphor. I just made that up. But some of the things that, we're trying to push folks to look at when you're looking at modernization is you're still dealing with customers who have knob and tube wiring in their home. I still go into customer homes and we're trying to weatherize it, but first we have to get rid of a roach infestation or a hoarder. And when you're thinking about modernizing the grid, those are the homes you're connecting to, and it's easy to get wrapped up in the sort of technology piece of it or the improvement piece of it, but if we don't stop and look at that, it's usually the least efficient housing with populations that have the highest energy burden and the lowest income. What are we modernizing this grid for? Reliability, but also affordability for those folks. And so we have to figure out how to tie all of that together. And a lot of times it's not pleasant to talk about in a workplace, gross things. I mean, I've worked on mobile homes that had dozens of dead animals underneath. But that's the world we live in. So how do we factor that into this clean and shiny conversation?
Thank you so much.
Just a quick comment on that. So when you talked about the knob and tube wiring, this is something that was actually new to me. So we're talking about electrification and how we're preparing for the future. And you have programs for low-income customers, and we want to focus on trying to electrify them first so that they can start receiving the benefits of that. But the knob and tube wiring, the cheapest way to go in there is wires on the surface, and they don't necessarily want that. Is that fair? So there's where I thought, oh, this is great. We're going to put money toward panel upgrades and stuff like that. But now you have another blocker. There's just so many things that in that space that you have to plan for. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to do it equitably to make sure that they can take advantage just like anybody else?
Awesome. Very great points across the board. I have one more question for our panelists, and I do want to open it up for questions from the audience, so please be thinking about your questions. We'll bring a mic to you. Would love to hear your questions for these wonderful people up here. So my last question is, what do you feel is missing from this discussion? Kimberly.
Culture. Because if you, it's like there's an old proverb that says that if you put new wine in old wineskins, it's gonna burst, right? If you've ever made wine, wine expands, it fizzes, it has gas to it. And I think in some cases we've tried to take this innovation culture and superimpose it over a more traditional culture within the utility sector. And one of the things I've been struck by this conversation is you have representation from a very technical sector. A lot of engineering staff, teams, focus. But the conversation has been about those softer skills that I mentioned earlier. It's about focusing on the needs. I learned when I worked for a big public hospital in my formative years, and I was a community relations person, and I would walk into their homes, and I didn't come from the same world that they came from, but I learned so much about the way people live and what to talk to them about what they need, even when I was working in oil and gas, because we would go into the neighborhoods, and until someone has the humility to ask what they need, what's going on with them, how this change will impact them, making sure that people can adapt to it, then you're not successful either, right? I couldn't accomplish my goals, my requirements of my employer. And in a way, that's really what you're facing in the energy sector is adopting these more, not just innovative, cool ways like Silicon Valley stuff, but it's really about this softer skill about being able to approach your work in a way that takes into account not just the measures, the electrons that you're moving, but how you deploy those electrons. It's a different day. And the ones who will do that and adapt to deploying people who come from non-traditional backgrounds the fastest. I've recently met with this very successful in terms of their innovation and modernization, this utility in Canada. And their driver is a leader that they hired who comes from the social sciences background. And that's terrific. And many of you are doing that. And in fact, to Nate's point, you came from a background that was non-traditional as well. But it makes the difference in terms of how we deploy those softer skills these days.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I would agree, and to expand on that, I would say regulatory collaboration is missing. And one of the panels yesterday morning, a guy joked that vendors might want to start showing up at NARUC, and I show up at NARUC. I've got a former regulator on my board, and I've, in recent months, spent a lot of time briefing state-level regulators, which is, not something venture-backed startups typically have to do. But the thing we found is that there is a huge disconnect between what's possible, what utilities think they're limited by, and what regulators actually want to see. Because regulators are rightfully setting the guardrails to make sure that we get safe, reliable energy delivery. But they're also driven by public policy mandates, and we have an affordability crisis. We have rising rates, and so the thing that's been interesting to me is those regulators are starting to pull us into these conversations now, bring the utility to the table and say, hey, did you know this is possible? And so that's the first step. We certainly need regulatory reform. I mean, when utilities don't have the ability to capitalize SaaS spending, which is software as a service, meaning you don't have to build a data center, you don't have to install it, you don't have to make someone run it, you just turn it on, just like you would watch Netflix. You can bring those types of capabilities to utilities right now, and I can tell you that most of the regulators I talk to would like to have that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Angie?
What Dan said, no. Although those are great points. Urgency. You guys know that meme of the dog in the room on fire and the dog is saying this is fine? Okay, thanks. I heard a chuckle, so someone knows it. I feel like that's my professional life. Is like, in some ways it feels like the world is ending, and how are we going to promote sustainability in a way that people care about, even with all of these more severe weather events happening. Customers aren't necessarily connecting that to the grid, to reliability. They're not thinking about it. And I don't personally think that the utility is the entity to make that connection for them. But if not us, who? We still have to spearhead that happening. So how do we message that, and how do we, frankly, make people care about something that they just don't really care about? We do customer segmentation, and we looked at all of our customers' data. Most of them don't care about sustainability. About 20% of them we identified as eco-aspirers. They want to be more sustainable. They want to take care of the planet, but it just really isn't a consideration. And I think for all of us working in this industry, we don't want that to be true. We all deeply care, but I think it's good to start from the reality of we want people to give a hoot about something they don't give a hoot about. And so where do we start?
Thank you. And Nate?
I think I'll echo some of Dan's points with the regulatory collaboration. I think we need to really make sure that relationship is evolving, and it's not a us versus them. When we've had that opportunity to have collaborative conversations, usually there's much better outcomes. And I know that there's different views on how close can your regulator be to the people that they're regulating, but making sure that there's that open communication and understanding what we're all trying to get to. I think the point about regulators being more educated on what's out there, a lot of times based on past histories and say rulings and stuff like that, utilities may be concerned about bringing something forward. We need to kind of break out of that cycle, and I think that would make a big difference.
Fantastic, thank you. So hold your applause. We're not quite done. We do have time for questions. So now it's your turn. Anybody got questions for our wonderful panelists? Alec will be bringing a mic to you. We couldn't have covered it all. We did cover it all. Okay, so fantastic. I can ask one more question that I had in the pipeline. Just let me unlock my phone real quick. Technology, y'all. Okay, so let's just wrap it up with final thoughts. Let's just do that. Dan.
Sure. I would say, the low-hanging fruit is just to widen our gaze and think, the world's changing faster than we can keep up with. There's a whole bunch of new stuff out there, as we've all talked about, and I think the challenge is figuring out how to create room to, again, as some folks said yesterday, fail fast, but fail small. And, we see this happening in places like Connecticut. I think it's PURA that's sponsoring some innovation programs, and that really, to Nate's point, it takes that leash off of the utility and says, okay, here, you've got some room to go and test things. And any other major business in the world has digital transformation programs underway, and utilities are unique in having these limitations that are put in by the regulatory environment. But there are ways to free this up, take those small risks, and again, regulators are looking to have these conversations.
Fantastic, thank you. Angie?
Yeah, I'd like to expand on that a little bit. I love that we're talking about changing our regulatory environment. I think a lot of us are always trying to affect change within the scope of what we already do, and with where we are in the world, that you can't go as far as you need to. But piloting and testing things is not always natural in the environments we work in. Since I've started managing pilot launch for Ameren last year, one thing I realized is I examined all of the pilots we did before 2022, and what I learned was they weren't really pilots. We were just like, this is new. Okay, now it's a program and we're running it. It has goals, and we're just gonna see if we meet the goals or not. That's not a pilot. We need to do things smaller. We need to set learning goals, and we need to position failure as the expectation, because often when we say it's okay to fail, okay, but you don't believe that though inside. You're like, I want to do it right. But if you start with that expectation of we don't have a goal, we just want to learn and we want to run it smaller, that's a big culture change, at least for the company that I'm in. But I think that's a way that we bring in smaller vendors into the conversation, because when you pilot small, the contracting terms are more reasonable. It's going to allow us to work more quickly, be more efficient with our resources, and with our ratepayers' money. But you have to really change your organization to be able to run like that.
Thank you. Nate?
One of the things I'm really excited that a lot of this talk is all in preparing for how we're dealing with climate change, and that's something I'm really getting excited about, that all of the programs that I get to put forward for modernizing our infrastructure, for helping customers achieve their goals, help our states, our country achieve the climate goals that we have. And it all starts with that backbone, and how is that prepared as quickly as possible to move us into the future.
Great. Kimberly?
If I may, I heard one
Please.
thing from Angie here that stuck with me. It's, taking the idea that here's some new thing, all these other utilities did it, let's just go big and wide right now and hope for the best. I was at a EEI conference last year in Orlando, and there was a great panel, including the chief customer officer at National Grid, basically being lambasted by, nicely by the rest of the utilities, saying, oh, well, you don't have smart meters yet. You don't need smart meters to solve a lot of these problems. And of course, that's a provocative thing for me to say to a lot of people in the room, but it rhymes with what Angie says of, this is the only way to do things, and that must change.
Well, that sets me up, tees me up for my remark beautifully. In fact, each one of them has said something. So whether it is piloting and having that mentality of the intention is to fail, which is also very uncomfortable for everybody, or that you don't have to do things the same way, or that you're making an impact in a new way to drive toward climate change. For me, what this all comes under, and what I watch folks, our friends in the utility sector do a lot, and we get to do with them, is flex new muscles. Is really what we're talking about, is building strength in areas that are new and different and sometimes uncomfortable. And one of the other areas that I'm finding is, I love the idea too of taking a different approach to regulators, but also in the sense of, one of the things we're also hearing that we haven't talked about yet, in terms of infrastructures, all this federal money that's coming down. And I have a colleague and I in EPIcenter. Between the two of us, we have about 50 years of experience, and I don't even want to talk how we allocate those years. But in grant work, right? And so it's very challenging to dig through the noise. But that is another place. Demonstrating value is a new language for some utilities as they approach to seek either buy-in from stakeholders, change from regulators, or funding from the federal government or state government. Not that you have not demonstrated value to stakeholders in other ways, but the way you have to do it and the way you have to cut through the noise about what demonstrating value in other people's terms. So what I love to sum this up is what I am thrilled to see and excited to be a part of is this building new musculature within this industry to change and grapple at the speed at which the change has to occur. And so I'm encouraged, and I'm excited about it, and I love being a part of it. So, and thank you, Joyce.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we're a couple minutes early. I'm gonna do one more sweep of the audience just to make sure I did not miss anybody with these bright lights. Any questions for the panelists?
And if there's not, can I make a somewhat related, somewhat unrelated plug?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Oh, we do have a question. Fabulous. Thank you.
Hey, I'm just wondering, as someone who works for a DERMS, but it's not quite a DERMS, building solutions for utilities, I've learned that they don't like to call things pilots because it takes extra paperwork. How do you communicate that idea of we're going to do a little chunk and we're going to test and learn without going through the whole spiel of what it is? What do you call that?
Limited deployment.
A limited deployment.
That's one.
That works. Other ideas?
Don't even call it a pilot, because everyone imagines something different when they think pilot. They do think it's going to be cool and techy, and that's not even necessarily true. There's a lot of things you can pilot that aren't technology. So we've been saying test. And we've created an entire way to do implementation planning that's different, because typically our team sits down, it's like deliverables, energy savings goal, budget. We really have to completely remove that from our mindset. So something that we're doing that's really hard is creating an implementation plan for a test without any deliverables. And then people are like, I don't know how to write this. I write from the goal backwards, but it's an interesting exercise.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes learning is your deliverable.
Yes, that is the deliverable, but it's so squishy. Business people hate that, yeah.
It's true.
Okay, excellent. Let's give them a round of applause. They're fabulous.